Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Paul Kolbe. I'm director of the Intelligence Project at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School. Really happy to have you here today. And I'm absolutely delighted to have two fantastic guests talk about Russia and Ukraine. We've got Beth E, former Principal Deputy Director for Mission Integration at the Directorate of National Intelligence, longtime CIA analyst, served in the policy community. Great to have you here, Beth. And we also have Jim Clapper, former Director of National Intelligence with a storied intelligence career, decades of service to his country. Both of them senior fellows at the Intelligence Project at the Belfer Center. So really happy to have you both here today. Maria, a couple of quick comments on ground rules.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you to everyone for being here. First off, the session is being recorded. If you would like to attribute anything you hear today, please do ask permission, but we will be recording this session today. And all of your cameras and microphones have been muted for the session, but please use the Q&A chat function or the Q&A function, and we will attempt to address as many of your questions in the dedicated Q&A portion as possible. Thank you. Paul, back over to you.
Thanks, Maria. So just a quick overview. Headlines have been bouncing back and forth. Invasion of Ukraine imminent. Now it's not imminent. We're going to have de-escalation, conflicting statements, mixed signals, lots of confusion. But by and large, situation where people see what might happen, believe they think what will happen, but in actuality, no one really knows for certain. Within that, we've got nonetheless an extraordinarily important set of questions that are going to arise no matter which way this goes. If Russia invades Ukraine, we're going to see the face of Europe changed for years, if not decades. If it doesn't invade Ukraine, fundamental issues will nonetheless not have been resolved. And we're going to see an extended period, I think, of both conflict in the shadows, but also jockeying for power, for influence, and for protecting interests on all sides. I've got an intelligence report, just came into my hands from February 4th, and I just want to read you an excerpt from it. Classified secret confidential political situation in Ukraine. My informant naturally looked forward to the reconstruction of an independent Ukraine state and was anxious to know how such a state would be received abroad and if it could expect to receive any financial or other support. I pointed out to him that no power would intervene against Russia now, and that the Russians en masse would never permit Ukraine to separate itself entirely from Russia. February 4th. February 4th, 1922. This is not a new issue that we're dealing with. Some of the fundamental issues, the fundamental questions of identity, of relationships, of where countries lie and where countries are able to influence the course of others around them are enduring. And so in that regard, I'm really looking forward to this discussion today. So we'll turn over the mic to Beth for some opening comments, and we'll go to Jim, and then we'll go to question and answer. Beth, over to you.
Well, that's a perfect segue, Paul. Thanks for having me as part of this panel. Really excited to be here and have this conversation to try to get out of the weeds and look a little bit more big picture. And I think that I'm starting the same place that you are, which is looking backwards a little bit and thinking about how does that inform our thoughts about what we should do in this case and in other cases. I think no matter what happens with Russia's aggression against Ukraine, it does lay bare the fact that no matter how principled we think that we are being, if we pursue what we think are these principled actions without thought about how these actions are perceived by other countries, we really lay ourselves open for surprises. There are always consequences for how we act. And we need to do a better job, in my view, of thinking about these things and planning for them. And I think that's where communities like this Harvard community and think tanks and the intelligence community have a really important role to play in raising these alarm bells. So I call this phenomena the reap what you sow. You reap what you sow. Maybe that's my pastor's kid background. And I don't want people to think that I'm apologist, for Russia, or that I'm turning into Tucker Carlson before your eyes. I am not. But the point is here is that the adversary and even our allies get a vote about how they perceive our actions. And sometimes we cause a lot of aggrievement in other countries. And I wanted to read my own quote from Bill Burns, now CIA director, but obviously, one of these experts on Russia. And he was posted to Moscow at the time. And he writes, on a dreary February afternoon in 2008, as snow fell steadily outside my office window, I wrote a long personal email to Secretary Rice emphasizing that Putin would see any move toward NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia as a serious and deliberate challenge. Today's Russia will respond. It will create fertile soil for Russian meddling in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. And he goes on to talk about the implications for the Georgia war, which of course took place just a few months later. And I think that, just like 1922 or 2019 or back in 2008, some of these things are foreseeable if we just take the time to look at them. And I would put, the Trump administration policies on Iran as another example of this. The reaction to pulling out of JCPOA and putting in the maximum pressure campaign is, in my view, why we're seeing Iranian actions as they are today. So, I just think that right now, we're in a position where countries are challenging the United States in terms of the long, steady international world order. Russia and China are clearly ganging up and putting forward this multipolar world order idea. And there are lots of people around the world who are thinking and maybe quietly applauding that idea, even if they're not applauding Putin and Xi. And I just think that we have to be even more careful about, our choices and to think about them. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Beth. Jim, over to you.
Well, a few comments, and I first completely agree with Beth about history's prologue, and particularly for intelligence people, they get it always serves us well to look at history, and I think your Human report from 1922 is evidence of that. And looking back, and I lived through this. What we did in the aftermath of the fall of the wall, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and our, I think, rather aggressive pursuit, or I'll say, how should I say it, aggressive willingness to accept new NATO members in Eastern Europe, and that maybe we didn't think through how that might be perceived. The Russia and the remnants of the Soviet Union were at an all-time low point in terms of their strength. A couple of comments, I maybe more tactical, I don't know, but I'll make them. I doubt, frankly, that Russia's going to do a full-up invasion of the full Monty, so to speak, of the Ukraine. I think it'll be a case of the dog catching the car, much like our situation in 2003 when we invaded Iraq. Well, now what? And clearly the Ukrainians will resist, and it'd be a very costly thing for the Russians. And one thing Putin can't afford, the irony here for Putin is that invading Ukraine is not going to do a damn thing for all the problems he faces at home. And to the contrary, it will make them worse. I think it'll also have another effect that unintended for him, which is to galvanize NATO. You're hearing now the likes of Sweden or Finland considering joining NATO. Don't think the sanctions that we put so much faith in are going to have a big effect, frankly, on Russia. I don't think that's a part of Putin's calculus. I understand there's some $630 billion and the Central Bank of Russia is in their part of their reserves. And I also understand that cutting Russia off from the SWIFT system, basically the economic telecommunication system, is off the table, as is restricting their exports of energy. Well, if those two tools of sanctions are not going to be considered, and I really wonder, and I don't know that that has much impact on Putin's calculus. I think the likely outcome is, we're going to have a reprise of Georgia, sort of maybe reinforce, solidify the Russian domination of the Donbass and the two states there, Donetsk and Luhansk, as independent states. One thing I'd like to highlight that I haven't seen anything on in the, at least the electronic media, is the fact that, just a reminder, there are 15 nuclear reactors in Ukraine at 4 complexes. And as we know, the Russians are not all that discriminate about targeting. So you can imagine the impact if one of those were either intentionally, which I can't imagine, or inadvertently struck, and you create another Chernobyl. And this would be a huge backlash for Russia, because the radiation patterns and the wind patterns, that could fall on Russia. So I hope in this, what I'm understanding to be this Tiger team that's set up in the interagency and is trying to walk through all the scenarios, that the Department of Energy is playing in that, and that they are considering this extremist possibility. Beth alluded to China and Russia, and we both sat in on an Atlantic Council session recently involving Steve Hadley, former National Security Advisor, and Kevin Rudd, former Prime Minister of China, of Australia, who is an authority on China, about that relationship. And it strikes me that the relationship between Russia and China that's emerging is much more than the enemy of my enemy is my friend. I think there's something much more substantive to that. Last thing I'll speak to is intelligence. Since I lived through 2014, and of course now there's a lot of attention being focused on the use of intelligence as an information operations tool, diming out the Russians on their false flag operations, being very open about using commercial imagery to portray the array of Russian forces surrounding on 3 sides of Ukraine, and whether that's a good thing or not. And in contrast, and I've noted the critiques of what we didn't do in 2014. Well, a couple of factors is one, the Russians were a bit more subtle about it in 2014, and in this case, they're subtle like a freight train. The technology has dramatically improved, particularly with respect to the use of commercial imagery, much higher resolution that's available openly than was available 8 years ago. And I think there is a realization. I applaud what the intelligence community is doing. There's always the thing about sources and methods and overdoing it. If you dime out the Russians on their false flag too many times, people won't pay any attention to it. The Russians like to do things with provocation, plays to their sense of grievance. And I think they will, if they do something, they'll have some sort of provocation. And I think the result will be a lot more skepticism internationally about any sort of provocation. So I'll stop there and go to questions.
Great, thanks, Jim and Beth. I'll open up with a couple of questions just to abuse my ability to hold the mic, and then we'll turn over to Maria to moderate some of the questions coming in from the audience. Encourage folks, if you have questions, to write them into the Q&A box, and we'll get to them as we can. So Beth, I want to go back to your kind of opening point on I think what Graham Allison would describe as either strategic narcissism and strategic empathy, right? So strategic narcissism in terms of what you described of, just looking at your own principles and not really understanding what the impact is on others. And then strategic empathy, going that next step farther and being able to look through the eyes of and understand the points of view of others without necessarily agreeing with them or accepting them. But are you arguing or putting forth that, but for, you know, our actions in NATO expansion, but for sort of our actions post collapse of the Soviet Union, that we wouldn't be seeing this?
I'm not sure that we should have or would have not done some of the things that are the fundamental problems for Russia. And I don't think we should accommodate, you know, Russia's idea of a sphere of influence outright. But I do think that some of our actions have felt more provocative than others. And I don't think we needed in 2008 to do the NATO promises of NATO. So I am for, you know, I was for at the time, and I think NATO expansion was really important. At the same time, we did have the whole Russia-NATO relationship that was building out, and that was offered as a, you know, kind of a parallel relationship in order to manage Russia concerns about NATO enlargement. So I do think that there was thought at that time to creating a system that Russia felt included in it, with the Russian NATO Council. But I think that these grievances go back to also just the fall of the Soviet Union, as Jim mentioned, and, you know, Putin's personal feelings of just the loss of empire. And we can't completely help the fact that they're, you know, we can't help at all the fact that they're an economic mess based on a system that is broken and is bound not to work because it is a terrible system. But I do think that, I personally think that we added to that maybe in ways, especially in 2008, that we did not need to. And it didn't accomplish anything. I think sometimes doing these things that are like really kind of grandstanding things rather than actually practical things that make sense, that's when we really get ourselves in trouble. When we just like make statements because we think that it makes us look like, you know, we're important or something. And that's really what 2008 was about.
I think it's really important that you point out, look, there were lots of things that were done with the expectation that Russia would become integrated into Western economies and Western pieces, if, you know, not become Western or not become, you know, a part of NATO, but nonetheless, there was a broad expectation that there would be an alignment of interests. And there was in U.S. in particular interests to help stabilize Russia, to help, you know, help with dismantling of chemical weapons programs and of excess nukes and of controlling radiological materials and of helping to privatize the economy. Billions of dollars poured in the 90s. But now it's viewed, you know, the popular conception is that in Russia is that this is a time when the West was simply kicking Russia while it was down. So it's, you know, counter to the facts. At the same time, there was a period, and I think you point to it around 2008, and that where successive administrations simply took an official stance of, we're going to ignore Russia, we're going to sideline Russia, it doesn't matter anymore. You know, you have comments like McCain's, et cetera. And I think a bit of hubris in terms of U.S. Thinking Russia didn't matter anymore and wasn't going to be important going forward. So I think you're right.
Russia, you know, a gas station masquerading as a country. You know, that was the McCain point, and it was funny to us, but you know, it's also kind of, you know, I respected John McCain a lot, but I mean, it's also a gas station with nuclear weapons.
And
maybe not best to corner, you know.
No, and with, you know, long history, deep sets of interest, enormous capability, enormous landmass, et cetera, et cetera. So there, you know, I think there was a lot of myopic looking and thinking around that. I was just reflecting that politicians and academics, sort of marveled that the Soviet Union collapsed without massive violence. It didn't go the route of Yugoslavia with six separate wars. But it strikes me that that the time frame that we were thinking in was simply too short. It's going back to the apocryphal story about, was it Zhou Enlai who was asked about the French Revolution, and said, well, it's too soon to tell. But he was. So true or not, it seems to me that what we're seeing is in many respects are the fundamental issues arising from the collapse of the Soviet Union still playing out. We saw it internally with Chechnya. We've seen it along the periphery with Georgia, Kazakhstan, and the states, and now we're definitely seeing it with Ukraine. And it goes back to that, where we started off with that kind of historical perspective of some of the same issues being back in 1922. Jim, let me ask you around. So you've watched the intelligence community for years and years. You saw the pivot to the global war on terrorism. Seems like a lot of what you're talking about in 2014 in terms of intelligence community performance was the fact that we weren't really thinking about Russia as a primary issue or the issues in Eastern Europe. Do you think that we're seeing the kind of an inflection point now of that pivot from focus on terrorism to focus on great power issues, i.e. Russia and China in particular?
Yeah, that's a great question, Paul, and I certainly hope so. For the most of the time that I was DNI, about 6.5 years, for most of that time, the greatest single claimant on intelligence resources in the NIP, the National Intelligence Program, was terrorism. Not Russia, not China, not North Korea or Iran, but terrorism. And I actually supported the Trump administration, or agreed with the Trump administration when they put out the national strategy, and in turn followed up by the Department of Defense on the National Defense Strategy, which called out Russia and China as peer competitors. What I hope that meant was a concomitant shift in resources to pay, and that's, in the end, put your money where your mouth is, more intelligence focus on Russia and China. I believe that's happened, but that always bothered me during my time as most of my time as DNI. So that's a very apt question, and I think that's changed. And appropriately it should.
Can I jump in there, Paul? I think one of the things that I am I'm thinking a lot now is that, we divide the world into these geopolitical buckets, right? It's like, we've got to do the Asia pivot and, that's Europe and Russia and, don't pay any attention to Africa. And I think that the way we bucket these things is really another kind of at our peril. All of these things are connected. And I think about it a lot when I think about, how we think about analysis in the intelligence community. You're a Russia analyst, you're a China analyst, and we don't have enough people who think about the whole world. And I think that's true of kind of life now in the Twitter sphere that people live in. Everybody's specialized. And we really need to think about our globe in more interconnected ways. And the crisis over Ukraine, I think, brings that into relief as well, because the whole Russia-China relationship, the implications for the international financial system, all these things actually are front and center.
I think that's an absolutely great point. The time when you could kind of use a map as being able to figure out where threats are and where they're emerging from is gone. So many of the major threats and things that are going to be affecting us in the decades ahead are absolutely transnational and absolutely have no borders, whether it's military, cyber, and in particular economic, as we think about those relationships. I think that's a great point, Beth. Let me ask one more question, and then we'll go to the questions that are stacking up in the audience, and we'll turn over to Maria to moderate through those. As you look out over the next, sort of decade or decades, do you think that the way we're configured with both intelligence and national security is set to be able to address those threats? Do we have the capability and challenges that'll be coming forward? Do we have the ability to meld together those silos that you're talking about, Beth?
Sure, we have the ability to do it. And I think that the intelligence community is thinking more about those things. But, I always feel like our systems, it just takes us a little bit longer. Security layered on top of everything makes us less agile. And I think we need to really work to, be able to increase the speed of adoption, and also to unleash creativity in a much more fundamental way. Because the talent is absolutely there and the skills are there. But that said, the US intelligence community is the best in the world by far. And we are, they are no longer we, but more integrated than ever. And I think that the leadership absolutely gets these issues. So, we're in a good place, but not good enough in my view. And I think that people need to, just keep driving forward as quickly as possible.
Jim, the preemptive use of intelligence that we've seen in this, how do you assess from your perspective, its effectiveness? It seems to me that it's been built on some great collection. And I can imagine the debates that took place in terms of using it. But do you think this is a new paradigm, or do you think it's a one-off?
No, I do. And I just want to, before I get to that, I just want to add to what Beth said about, that we have the capability and we also have the resources. The money that the United States spends on intelligence exceeds the GDP of a lot of countries. Fundamental to that continued support, though, is the support of the public. And to me, that's a call for the intelligence community to be a lot more transparent about what it does, which is a segue to answer your question about using intelligence in a preemptive sense. I absolutely agree with it. I guess the caveat is moderation in all things with due consideration for protection of sources and methods. Transparency is great. It's a double-edged sword because adversaries go to school on that very transparency. But I do think we need to play more aggressively in the information operations space as the Russians do. We've got to push back using the same tools, and a very important input there is intelligence. And obviously, you need to be judicious, though, about as you well understand, and Beth does, about drawing up very valuable sources in your effort to be active in the information operations space. But overall, I think it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, I think on one hand, intelligence collection it can be extraordinarily fragile and easily lost and difficult to put into place. But on the other hand, if you don't use it, then it's sort of pointless as well, if you just sort of keep it under a bushel. So I think it's a really interesting phenomenon, and I would expect that we'll see more of it coming down the road. Maria, we've got a bunch of questions coming in from the audience. You want to go ahead and put some of them together?
Absolutely. Thank you. This is clearly stimulating a lot of thought, a lot of interest. We have 249 people. I think I saw it hit 250 here. So lots of participants and a lot of questions coming in. The first one I was going to raise actually was just partially answered, but we had a couple questions come in on the subject of intelligence diplomacy and using intelligence proactively. including to get ahead of Russian information warfare. So the other part of the question I don't think we've fully addressed yet is, to what extent do you believe that's actually influenced Putin's behavior? To what extent it's been successful? And what does the current situation in terms of the US employing intelligence to better understand Russia's intentions in Ukraine tell us for going forward? What should we be seeing the US intelligence community doing going forward?
Maybe I should try at that, since just to follow up on something. So Jim recently responded to that question saying, like, I think, Jim, we're not, we may never know the answer to that on how, how effective it was. But, this point about the provocation that Jim made and is absolutely key to this. I think we've really narrowed Putin's options. He cannot invade Ukraine without a pretext, because he has been saying publicly that Russia has no intention of starting a war. So he obviously needs something that it is a provocation. And this intelligence has made that a lot harder. It allows people to, say, oh, I expected that, so I get that, to call question into it. But I think it just really narrows it, his range of actions. And it may be why we're seeing some pivoting. Not that he didn't have all these options on the table and he's kind of picking and choosing and pushing one button and seeing, like, pushing here, pushing there, and seeing how this all goes. But I think it probably is having some effect, and I think it's probably having some effect in the intelligence services as well, and causing some disruption and probably some finger pointing, which I love.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's disruptive and distracting. I'm not sure it's compelling, but the other point I would make here is that Putin is not the only audience for this. There is a global audience that in which it's to our benefit to expose what the Russians are doing. So it's not just getting to them, but it's a messaging, and that's what a lot of this is about, is messaging the international community as well.
And there's a Russian people audience as well. None of the information that I've seen suggests that there's a great clamor among Russian citizens to launch a war of choice against their relatives, against their friends, against former colleagues and comrades in Ukraine. I think it's ironic that if in fact preemptive intelligence is able to shape behavior or change decisions, that will then be portrayed in some circles as a colossal intelligence failure. The U.S. comes out and says, look, invasion is imminent, no invasion takes place. Well, obviously this was an intelligence failure. And I think the Russians have already started to do that and to sarcastically make remarks about that. So I would pocket that as a win.
Paul, this is kind of like never getting credit for all the terrorist attacks that we thwarted.
No, it's exactly right. Yeah, that disruptive effect of disrupting terrorist operations. This is an entirely different kind of scale and board. It's really interesting. Back to you, Maria.
Absolutely. Thank you, Paul. We have a lot of questions coming in. Again, I'm going to try to group them by theme, even if it means giving you a double-barreled question at once. So we have a few questions coming in on Russia's intent. And one very interesting one that came in a bit earlier was whether you assess a risk of deniable asymmetric Russian attacks on countries and companies that are supporting the Ukrainian government. So probably meaning cyber attacks, I think, if I'm interpreting the question correctly here. And then there are other questions coming in terms of Russia's economic situation and for how long can Russia sustain a military buildup along the border with Ukraine? And are there other economic pressures that we'll start to see on Russia, such as access to agriculture through the blacks, or through me, I believe came up as an early one, but various pressures on Russia, and what do we see as Russia's intent? And are we likely to see unattributed cyber attacks by Russia on companies and countries supporting Ukraine?
I'll take the Russia econ question. So Russia's ability to sustain this projected force, and Jim knows more about this from his military experience than I do, but I never have a problem talking about stuff I don't know exactly about, but what I've been told. But I think that they can sustain, you know, being in the field. It's not about economics in the Russian system. It's about being able to sustain that many forces forward deployed. And, you know, Russia is employing this very interesting strategy of putting a lot of heavy equipment in, and then they move the personnel in last, right? And so we can see in places where, you know, they might move personnel back a little ways to put them back into barracks instead of into tents. You know, that could happen down the road and still leave the military, you know, the heavy equipment in place. And we get into this kind of hybrid pressure campaign. But it's not really about economics. It's about, you know, they can probably sustain this many people forward deployed for weeks, right? You know, probably into mid-March. But at some point, you do have to decide what are you going to do with that many people forward deployed and the logistics lines that you have to maintain to keep those up. You know, Russia can sustain quite a bit. I mean, he's made, you know, this huge piggy bank of basically $650 billion of reserves. Plus he has over $200 billion of reserves in his, you know, in these investment funds that they have. They've made absolutely a windfall with the oil and gas revenue this year, far outpacing their budget, the point that they expected for their budget. You know, probably about, if we go up to $100 a barrel, will be more than double what their expected income was from that. And their budget is about 40% dependent on oil and gas. So they are like killing it. So they can maintain this for a while, but there really is a long-term implication here. And that is, you know, when Putin was in China, he didn't get anything on oil and gas. Not really. He did not get a Power Siberia 2 pipeline, which has been in negotiation for some time. He got a deal that will take 2 to 3 years to build a connector from the Sakhalin Island. That field has nothing to do with the European gas fields. And Paul knows more about this than I do. So feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but he can't really shift very easily without billions and billions of dollars and years of investment. He cannot shift away from the European market. And so I really wonder, I don't think there would be a long-term boycott, you know, a cutting off of gas 100% for any length of time that he couldn't somehow justify from technical means or something, because that market is too important to them. I don't know if, Paul, you want to pick up on that.
No, I think you're absolutely right, Beth. Yeah, just, I mean, the practical, logistical, financial pieces of it, infrastructure, energy infrastructure doesn't change quickly or easily. The second is, you know, Russia, going back to the days of the Soviet Union, has consistently sort of projected itself as a stable, reliable supplier of energy. Now, there have been some, you know, interruptions in that. And, you know, we saw gas cutoffs to Ukraine, which had impact downstream from that in Europe in like 2008, 2009 time frame. But by and large, Russia said, we sign a contract, you can count on it for that. You know, I would anticipate, instead of complete cutoffs, I would anticipate, you know, sort of technical difficulties or, you know, need for maintenance or, you know, claims of, you know, cyber attacks have taken our, you know, systems down and we'll have to throttle back, you know, by 30%, which is enough to signal to markets in particular. And at the same time, every buck a barrel the price goes up, you know, means between $1 and $2 billion more in the Russian coffers. So there are some trade-offs there as well.
Paul, if I might, just a few quick comments here is, again, an unintended consequence for Putin is, I think, the hardening of the resolve on the part of Europe to become more energy independent. And there have been substantial improvements in the energy distribution system within Europe, more ports available for the injection of energy. So I think, again, an unintended consequence is, I think, a hardening resolve not to be dependent on Russia for energy. Another pacing factor for, you know, how long can they stay is the weather. When the weather warms up and it's not going to be, the ground conditions are not going to be conducive to a very track and vehicle heavy military presence that the Russians represent. So I just comment on that. The question about Russian intent. Well, Russian intent in my mind is Putin's personal intent. And to me, he's a throwback to the czars, this great vision of a great Russia. And that, you know, is much more of a spiritual, emotional motivation for him as far as his intent goes. So I don't think it's collectively Russia as a people, but it's Putin personally.
Mhm.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Beth. Maria?
Thank you very much for that. I wanted to pick up a little bit more on the question of what we're likely to see in terms of implications for countries and businesses. So the question that I believe is about cyber, but are we likely to see, as opposed to conventional warfare by Russia, a continuing escalation? I think we're seeing some indications already, but are we likely to see Russian attacks, potentially non-attributed attacks against countries or companies that seem sympathetic to Ukraine?
Jim, do you want to go on that or you want me?
Well, if I understood the question, I do think that we're going to be in a perpetual state of information operations harassment, notably against Ukraine to damage its economy, and that is already having that effect. And I think that we're going to see that in perpetuity. And I think as far as businesses, well, I think Russia will be very pragmatic about that. But if the question is whether, you know, singling out, say, U.S. businesses, it could. I don't know. I just think they're going to be very opportunistic about that. But I think, and they could do things certainly to harass us as well. You know, we're not exempt from this these forms of harassment by any stretch.
Yeah, I think that, you know, we are more likely to be seeing this kind of hybrid warfare, and maybe for an extended period of time. I agree with Jim on this. I'm actually thinking that a full out invasion now is much less likely. And I hope that that's right. I could be wrong on that, but you know, the intelligence community is seeing things that we're not seeing. But I think that, you know, as they kind of play out this diplomatic dance, which could be buying time, it makes Putin look big and good and, you know, a world figure, and it gives them time to fabricate a provocation if they want to go that way. But it also gives them time to just wear down the Ukrainians, wear down their economy, and the psychological effects. Yesterday's attacks, these DDoS attacks on the two biggest banks and the defense ministry public site, you know, these are really designed more to make people worried and afraid and not to trust their government, right? So it's I think that there's a big psychological element to this, as well as an economic element that go hand in hand, because the point is that they want to depose Zelensky. You know, they want to create a puppet government, and there are lots of ways of going at that. And I think this is one of them. Thank
you very much. We have a few questions coming in on Russian election interference in the US. So I was hoping you could please address that. So the first one is whether influencing the upcoming US elections this year and then in 2024 is part of the Russian calculus, whether you would assess that that is likely to take place. And then the second question is that given that both of you were in senior positions when Russia interfered in the US 2016 presidential election, but with the questioner as the caveat that policymakers set policy, knowing what you know now, is there anything you believe the US government should have done differently about Russian election interference? I'm going to let the master answer that one.
Well,
what a punt.
Yeah. Well, I think, yeah, the Russians are going to always interfere. I mean, we are unfortunately a ripe target for them because they will continue to exploit the polarization and divisiveness in this country. As far as, you know, the presidential election 2024, I think they'll do the same thing they did in 16, which was we'll figure out who the candidate that's best for us, and then we'll do what we can to support that candidate and hurt the other one, just as they did in the 2016. So this is something we ought to deal with. As far as what the coulda, woulda, shouldas, well, in my view, we should have been a lot more aggressive about diming out the Russians in the run-up to the 2016 election. And there was a big debate about that. The president himself was concerned about if we magnify this, or if we talk about it, because I remember commenting once to President Obama at one of our endless meetings about this, that I thought at some point he needed to go on primetime television and talk to the American people before the election about what the Russians were doing. There was reluctance to do that. Again, contemporary conditions prevailing at the time about magnifying what the Russians were doing, and the president was very concerned about the appearance of him putting his hand on the scale in favor of one candidate over the other. Well, in retrospect, maybe that wasn't such a great, we should have been more aggressive about using intelligence, by the way, to educate the American people. When we finally had, after all the debate business, and Jay Johnson and I put out a statement on the 8th of October of 16, which was exquisite in its timing, because that's the same day the Access Hollywood tapes came out. So our message was emasculated. And of course, we did things, we sanctioned the Russians and all that, but after the election, should have been beforehand.
I think that one of the things I'll add is that the Russian techniques for how they interfere have shifted over time. And, in 2016, it was all about bots, and then that was exposed. And, they went much more toward, kind of seeding with real people, and including, important people. And I think what you're seeing right now among parts of our country where you have people who are, elected officials or very popular media figures coming out saying things, speaking almost like an RT, Russia Today spokesperson would say about, Russia, basically using Russian talking points. They don't need to do the same kinds of things that they did in 2016 because of where our country is today and the divisions that we have. And I think that they will just exploit and feed and encourage more this high level kind of thing. When you have Americans giving Russian talking points, it's a lot easier for them.
If I could just reinforce what Beth just said, and I think proof of that was in the midterms of 2018. The Russians didn't do that much. They didn't have to.
Yeah, I'll just go back to Lenin talking about useful idiots. Still
present company excluded, I hope.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you very much. Sorry, Paul, did you want to?
No,
speak?
go ahead, Maria.
Thank you. We have a lot of questions coming in about China, so I wanted to make sure that we did address those. One questioner is asking about Putin's visit to China for the opening of the Olympic Games and the reporting that Putin didn't get what he needed from Xi, along with the questioner notes that China holds that countries should respect the sovereignty of other countries. So that's one question in terms of, I would interpret that as to what extent are they aligned? And then another questioner asked to what extent you believe there's coordination between Russia and China to challenge the US and Ukraine. So is China playing a role behind the scenes?
I just wanted to note that the foreign ministry, China's foreign ministry came out today for, kind of the first time making a big statement about Ukraine. Ukraine did not appear in the large communique as a word. It did, the Chinese have said that Russia's points in the past, are reasonable and folks need to listen to them. But today, the foreign ministry called on Western governments to lift sanctions against Russia and not to impose further sanctions, and sanctions just increase contentions. And they also took the Russian talking point that the Minsk process is the path to, a diplomatic solution. And I think that this underscores China is, China wants stability more than anything else because they're a trading nation. They have very, very different interests than Russia. China's economic trade relationship with Europe is a lot more important than their trade relationship with Russia, even though they have other things that they benefit from that relationship. It's a complicated situation, but they don't want sanctions because it could, having to uphold sanctions against Russia is what will happen, like that they will be put in a position where they have to decide whether they're going to break US sanctions or European sanctions against Russia, because Chinese items will have US and European technology components in them. And if there's banking sanctions, not SWIFT, but just against banks, the energy trade is conducted in dollars, sometimes euros, but not, in rubles. So it's a real problem for them. And I do think that they have an interest in stability, in opposing invasions, and they, want this to be worked out diplomatically. So it's not a, China's all in on this.
I would just add that I think one of the things that is bringing China and Russia together is they both chafe under the the international rules that the United States frankly imposed post World War II, and so one of the reasons that we use sanctions as a powerful tool to try to induce a change in behavior is because of they're based on the U.S. imposed economic system that prevails globally. Well, both Russia and China, whatever their differences are united in opposition to that as the governing body of rules that governs economic behavior in this world. And that's why I think this relationship between China and Russia is different than it has been in the past.
I agree so much with that. And, I think that their manifesto was all about that. It was every multipolar institution that they could think of was mentioned, including their own that they're building up, like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as an alternative. But, we ignore the UN at our peril because so much happens in the UN in standard setting, in sanctions. And we just cannot be absent. We have to be, in my view, really aggressive at the UN to make sure that, we're representing the international world order where there is order and countries can't just invade other countries. So there's a lot of threat. I agree completely. I think that the people who say that there's nothing to the Russia-China relationship and that it's not going anywhere miss this point that them teaming up against us in the international system poses actual real threats to us.
I couldn't agree more. And I think it's really ironic that at the height of US post-war power, coming out of World War II, when we were at the peak of our economic military influence across the world, we paid lots of attention to creating, building, participating, and leading multinational institutions. UN's a great example. It just strikes me as insanity that we've got this amazing collection of capabilities on our doorstep, on our turf, that we ignore while others take advantage of it, particularly around the standard settings and the different pieces of that. Frustrating, yes. Get our way all the time, no. But I think, so much of what we're seeing in terms of the US domestic politics is having trouble accommodating ourselves to the world that is more normal, i.e. one where the US is a strong player, but not the only player, as opposed to that brief period of time after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So, this period where, we had the peace dividend and this, blithe assumption that the US was going to, reign supreme, into perpetuity, and with no effort. So I think, accommodating ourselves to a world in which, we do have both not unlimited power, but have rivals that are gaining power. It's simply a reality. I want to shift. We just got a couple more minutes. There's a last question from the audience, and give you guys give you guys a minute to sum up or to sort of give last reclamas. So this is on fundamental security architecture in Europe, and the question is: current architecture seems stuck in a feedback loop. Every new NATO member antagonizes Russia further, intentionally not, and Russian activities in Belarus, in the Balkans, etc. Do the same for us. Is there a larger scale solution possible, a reimagining of European security architecture, which would be more stable, which would be more predictable, and which would accommodate most, if not all, of the respective parties' interests?
Well,
just a small question for you.
Yeah, yeah.
4 minutes. Go.
In 2 minutes. I actually think there is a ray of hope here, and that is in the realm of arms control. I think it's important and in our best interests to engage in strategic arms control discussions and an agreement. And I think the same approach needs to be and could be taken in Europe. Has not to do with restricting NATO membership, but rather more transparency, more confidence in what is actually, what the confrontation actually is, and trying to reduce that to agreements on what is permissible and what is not. Having inspections, mutual inspections, much has been done in the past with strategic assault and START. So I think if there's a way ahead here, it's there, and I think it's in the Russians' best interests as well as ours to do that.
Me too. I think that going back to the Cold War lessons of just working through these kinds of negotiations based on confidence building measures, yes, but actual like real changes on the ground to what forces are there and inspections. I'd love to deal with Kaliningrad. I think the big problem with that is actually domestic politics in the US. I think that domestic politics in the US makes it very, very hard for us to have these kinds of negotiations where we just like work through point by point. Everybody's trying to score settle, and I would say it would be on both sides, no matter who was in charge. I just think that we need to get back to a point where we have some fundamental agreement with Congress about being able to approach these kinds of adversaries with a united voice. We're doing that on China more and more. So maybe there's a ray of hope here on Russia, but we can't just all be about bashing Russia. I think that we need to figure out how to constrain them and deal with this crisis, but we also need to look forward about how do you use mechanisms in order to create more stability so we don't find ourselves back in this position again or in a worse position. That can't be taboo, but I kind of feel like it is. I kind of feel like people will attack me for saying like, oh, we should be talking to Russia.
Jim?
Well, no, I agree. I think Beth is right, and I think she makes a very good point about the constraint here, probably less with the Russians than it is with our own domestic politics.
Great. 30-second question, lightning round. You're in the elevator with Putin. What are the two things you're going to say to him? Terrible question. Go, Beth.
Are you kidding me?
No.
I have no idea. What would I say to him? I would say, if you think that this is going to turn out in a way that makes Russia more stable and more secure, which I know is your goal, you got to think twice. Because looking down a little bit longer past your nose, I don't see this going that way. And it's not about threats of sanctions or anything like that. I think it's just the long-term interests of Russia are not acting like this.
Great. Jim?
I agree. NATO is not a threat, And invading Ukraine doesn't solve any of the formidable problems you have at home.
Yeah.
Jim and Beth, thank you so much for being with us today. Really enjoyed this conversation. Looking forward to seeing you up in Cambridge. Thanks to the audience. Great questions coming in. Apologize for the ones that we couldn't get to, but we tried to get to as many as you can. Maria, thank you very much as well. Look forward to seeing you guys soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.